The night in Milwaukee felt ordinary in a way that now feels almost cruel. Streetlights reflected on wet pavement, a soft orange glow stretching across empty sidewalks. Cars passed slowly, radios low, windows closed against the cold. Inside apartment buildings, people prepared for sleep, trusting that the walls around them were enough to keep the world outside from crossing a line. No alarms were sounding, no screens cut through the air. Nothing about that night suggested it would one day be remembered as part of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. And that is exactly why it matters. Because this story does not begin with violence. It begins with normality, with routine, with the terrifying idea that the most disturbing crimes can exist quietly, hidden behind habits, assumptions, and the belief that evil always looks obvious. What if the real horror of the Jeffrey Dahmer case isn't what he did, but how long it took anyone to notice? Before we go any further, if you want to understand how crimes like this are allowed to grow unnoticed, how warning signs are ignored, and how systems fail again and again, subscribe to Open Case Files now. This channel doesn't rush stories. We don't sanitize them. We tell them fully, because understanding how something happens is the only way to prevent it from happening again. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in 1960 in West Allis, Wisconsin, a quiet suburban area that mirrored the image of post-war American stability. His father, Lionel, was an analytical man, a chemist by profession, logical and methodical. His mother, Joyce, struggled deeply with anxiety, depression, and emotional instability. Their household was not violent, but it was tense. Love existed, but so did emotional distance. Arguments were frequent. Affection was inconsistent. For a child like Jeffrey, who already struggled to connect, this environment did not create chaos, it created emptiness. From an early age, Dahmer appeared different. He was quiet to the point of invisibility. He struggled with eye contact, rarely initiated conversation, and showed little interest in forming friendships. Teachers noticed his detachment, but described him as polite and well-behaved. Classmates sensed something off, something uncomfortable, but not something dangerous. He was strange, not threatening, and that distinction would protect him for years. One behavior, however, stood out even then. Jeffrey became fascinated with dead animals. He collected roadkill from the roadside, brought bones home, and examined them obsessively. He learned how to clean skeletons, how to dissolve tissue, how to preserve remains. This wasn't hidden behavior. Adults knew. Instead of alarm, it was framed as curiosity, as science, as a phase. His father even encouraged learning anatomy, believing knowledge would create control. What it actually created was familiarity, and familiarity removes fear. As Jeffrey entered adolescence, isolation became his default state. Puberty brought confusion, not only about identity, but about desire. He struggled deeply with his sexuality, with feelings he did not understand and could not express. Rather than seeking connection, he withdrew further. Alcohol entered his life early, and it did not arrive casually. It arrived as a solution. By his teenage years, Dahmer was drinking heavily, often before school, using alcohol to numb anxiety, loneliness, and impulses he could not name. Teachers noticed the drinking. Administrators noticed the behavior. Classmates joked about it. No one stopped it. His parents' marriage deteriorated completely, ending in divorce shortly before Jeffrey graduated high school. In the chaos of separation, something remarkable happened. Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. No supervision, no daily structure, no emotional support. For weeks, he lived in isolation, drinking, thinking, fantasizing. It was during this period that the boundary between thought and action collapsed. Shortly after graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. The act itself was disorganized and impulsive, unlike the calculated pattern that would come later. What matters most is not the mechanics of the crime, but the aftermath. There was no arrest, no suspect, no serious investigation that led back to him. Life continued uninterrupted. And in that moment, Dahmer learned something profoundly dangerous. He could cross an irreversible line and remain unseen. That lesson did not fade, it hardened. In the years that followed, Jeffrey Dahmer drifted through adulthood without direction. He enrolled in college briefly, failed quickly, and dropped out. He joined the U.S. Army, where discipline briefly imposed structure, but alcohol and instability followed him there as well. He was discharged early and returned home, more detached than before. Jobs came and went, apartments changed. Nothing anchored him. He left no strong impression on anyone, and that was his greatest camouflage. During this time, he was arrested for minor offenses, including indecent exposure. Each incident was treated as isolated, a one-off, a misunderstanding, a problem with alcohol. There was no pattern analysis, no deeper look. The system addressed behavior, not motivation. And every time Dahmer was released, the message was the same: you are not a threat. By the late 1980s, Dahmer moved to Milwaukee, into apartment buildings filled with people living close together but rarely connecting. It was an environment built on anonymity. Neighbors shared walls but not lives. This was where his crimes escalated dramatically, not in chaos, but in control. Dahmer began targeting young men, often meeting them in bars or on the street. His approach was calm, polite, almost shy. He offered money for companionship or for posing in photographs. There was no force at first, no aggression. He relied on trust, on social politeness, on the assumption that danger announces itself loudly. It rarely does. What drove Dahmer was not rage, it was fear. Specifically, fear of abandonment. He did not want relationships that could end. He wanted permanence, control, silence. His crimes were attempts to freeze connection, to eliminate loss by eliminating autonomy. This psychological drive shaped everything he did next. Inside his apartment, warning signs accumulated. Neighbors complained of overpowering smells. Maintenance workers reported disturbing conditions. Sounds were heard at night that did not make sense. Police were called, multiple times. Each time, explanations were accepted. Spoiled food, a broken freezer, a misunderstanding between adults. Authority was satisfied with surface answers. No one wanted to push further. There was one moment, more than one, but one stands above the rest, when everything could have ended. A victim escaped Dahmer's apartment, disoriented, injured, barely able to speak. Witnesses begged officers to intervene, insisting something was terribly wrong. Dahmer spoke calmly. He looked ordinary. He sounded reasonable. The officers believed him. The victim was returned. That decision didn't just fail one person, it sealed the fate of many others. After that, Dahmer operated with renewed confidence. He had learned that authority could be persuaded, that discomfort discouraged scrutiny, that normal appearance was armor. His crimes continued, hidden behind thin walls and thicker assumptions. The end, when it finally came, was not the result of careful profiling or institutional vigilance. It came because someone fought back. An intended victim resisted, escaped, and led police directly to Dahmer's apartment. What they found erased every doubt instantly. Evidence that could no longer be explained away. Silence that could no longer protect him. Dahmer was arrested in 1991. He confessed fully, calmly, in disturbing detail. There was no attempt to deny what he had done. During the trial, experts debated his mental state, his capacity for empathy, his awareness of right and wrong. He was diagnosed with multiple disorders, but ultimately deemed legally sane. He understood his actions, and the sentence reflected that reality. But answers did not come with the verdict, only questions. How did this last so long? How many warnings were ignored? And how many crimes are only possible because no one wants to look too closely? This was only the beginning.
What makes the story truly disturbing is not just what Jeffrey Dahmer did, but how long he was able to do it without being stopped. By the time the police finally understood the scale of his crimes, Dahmer had already built a private universe of violence, secrecy, and control that existed in plain sight. He was not hiding in the shadows of abandoned buildings or remote forests. He was living in an apartment complex, surrounded by neighbors, working a job, shopping for groceries, paying rent. Evil, in this case, did not wear a mask. It wore the face of an ordinary man who smiled politely and blended into the background. As the years passed, Dahmer's urges escalated. What began as fantasies became compulsions, and what were once isolated acts turned into a pattern. He no longer sought just control in the moment, he wanted permanence. He wanted his victims to stay, to never leave, to exist only for him. This desire led him down a path that grew more grotesque and calculated with each passing encounter. He experimented, adapted, learned from his own mistakes. Every crime made the next one easier, faster, and more efficient. Fear faded. Routine took over. His apartment became the center of everything. From the outside, it looked like any other unit in the Oxford Apartments complex in Milwaukee. Inside, however, it slowly transformed into something else entirely. The walls absorbed secrets. The air carried a smell that neighbors would later describe as unbearable. Complaints were made, excuses were offered. Management accepted explanations about spoiled meat, broken freezers, strange habits. The truth was far worse, but no one could imagine it yet. And that disbelief became Dahmer's greatest shield. Dahmer targeted vulnerable people, those less likely to be missed immediately, those society often ignored. Many were young men from marginalized communities. Some were struggling, some were trusting, some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dahmer used charm, money, alcohol, and false promises to lure them back to his apartment. Once inside, the situation shifted. Control replaced consent. Escape became nearly impossible. And yet, time after time, the system failed to intervene. There were moments when this story could have ended much earlier. Moments where law enforcement crossed paths with Dahmer and walked away. Moments where victims briefly escaped only to be returned to him. One of the most chilling incidents involved a young victim who managed to flee Dahmer's apartment, disoriented and injured. Neighbors called the police. Officers arrived. Dahmer calmly explained the situation, minimizing it, manipulating it, reframing it as a misunderstanding between adults. Despite visible warning signs, despite desperate protests, the police accepted Dahmer's version of events. They escorted the victim back to him. That night, the opportunity to stop a monster slipped away. From that point on, Dahmer seemed to feel untouchable. Each close call reinforced the belief that he could continue without consequence. The fear of being caught diminished, replaced by a dangerous confidence. His behavior became more reckless, the crimes grew bolder, the frequency increased, and the apartment, already a place of horror, became a laboratory of obsession. He kept items as trophies, he documented his actions, he tried to preserve control even after death, driven by a desire that went beyond violence into something deeply pathological. Meanwhile, the world outside continued as normal. News cycles focused on other stories. People passed Dahmer on the street without a second glance. Co-workers saw him as quiet, strange, but harmless. Neighbors complained about smells and noises, but never imagined the truth. This disconnect between appearance and reality is what makes the case so unsettling. It forces a question that lingers uncomfortably. How many warning signs do we ignore every day? As investigators would later piece together the timeline, it became clear that Dahmer's crimes were not spontaneous explosions of rage. They were deliberate, planned, and fueled by a growing internal void. He drank heavily, yet remained functional. He isolated himself emotionally, yet craved connection in the most distorted way possible. He was not driven by money or fame or ideology. He was driven by control, by loneliness, by an obsession that fed on itself until it consumed everything. The psychological profile that emerges from this period is one of contradiction. Dahmer expressed guilt, yet continued. He recognized his actions as wrong, yet felt powerless to stop. He spoke of wanting help, yet never truly sought it. This internal conflict did not slow him down. If anything, it intensified his behavior. Each crime was followed by a brief sense of relief, quickly replaced by renewed urges. It was a cycle that spiraled faster and darker with time. By now, the apartment was no longer just a crime scene. It was a symbol of failure. Failure of institutions, failure of communication, failure of empathy. Multiple systems brushed against this case and missed what was happening inside those walls. The signs were there, scattered across years of complaints, encounters, and overlooked details, but no one connected them in time. And this is where the story takes on an even heavier weight, because Dahmer did not operate in isolation. He existed within a society that repeatedly looked away, a society that trusted appearances, a society that dismissed discomfort, a society that, unintentionally or not, allowed him to continue. The horror, then, is not only what he did, but how easily it happened.
As the number of victims grew, so did the risk. Dahmer was pushing the limits of what he could control. His routine became more fragile. The margin for error shrank. One mistake, one unexpected interruption, one moment of resistance could bring everything crashing down. The question was no longer if he would be caught, but when. And when that moment came, the truth would be far worse than anyone imagined. What authorities would eventually discover inside that apartment would shock even seasoned investigators. Details so disturbing that they would redefine the public's understanding of evil. Evidence that suggested not just murder, but a prolonged descent into something far more disturbing. And when the door finally opened, the illusion of normalcy would be shattered forever. At this point in the story, the tension is unbearable. Dahmer is operating at full capacity, unchecked, emboldened by years of evasion. His crimes are escalating, his confidence is peaking, and the system that failed to stop him is about to be forced to confront its own blindness. The spiral is tightening, the collapse is coming, and what follows will leave scars that extend far beyond one man or one apartment. What makes the Jeffrey Dahmer case sink deeper into the stomach is not simply the violence itself, but the slow realization that it continued for years while brushing past authority, neighbors, and institutions that were meant to protect people. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer was no longer improvising. He had entered a phase of repetition, refinement, and emotional detachment that allowed him to function outwardly while committing unspeakable crimes behind closed doors. This was no longer chaos. This was routine. Dahmer's apartment at the Oxford Apartments complex became the nucleus of his life. Everything revolved around that space. It was where he felt control, where his fantasies could exist without interruption, and where he believed he could shape reality to his will. To outsiders, it was just another unit in a decaying building. To Dahmer, it was a private world where rules no longer applied. Inside those walls, he wasn't awkward or powerless. He was dominant, and that transformation is one of the most chilling aspects of the case. The men Dahmer brought back were often trusting, sometimes desperate, and frequently overlooked by society. He exploited that invisibility. His approach was methodical: conversation, alcohol, an offer of money or companionship, and then the promise of safety that vanished once the door closed. What followed was rarely loud or chaotic. Dahmer avoided attention. He avoided conflict. Control, for him, was quiet. It was calculated, and because of that, it went unnoticed far longer than anyone could imagine. As his crimes continued, something darker emerged. Dahmer was no longer satisfied with temporary dominance. He wanted permanence. He wanted ownership. This obsession pushed him to experiment, to cross lines that even he once considered impossible. He spoke later about wanting to create living companions who could not leave him, who could not reject him. This desire blurred the line between fantasy and reality until the two became indistinguishable in his mind. What began as loneliness had metastasized into something monstrous. The apartment itself began to tell a story, even if no one wanted to hear it. Neighbors complained about a foul odor that seeped into hallways and stairwells. Some said it made their eyes burn. Others said it was unbearable in the summer heat. Management confronted Dahmer more than once. Each time, he offered an explanation: spoiled food, a broken freezer, chemical spills from his job.
These excuses were accepted with minimal scrutiny. The truth, hidden in plain sight, remained untouched. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this phase is how close Dahmer came to being stopped. On more than one occasion, victims escaped his apartment in a state of confusion and distress. In one infamous incident, a young boy managed to flee and was found wandering the streets by neighbors who immediately sensed something was wrong. Police were called. Dahmer arrived calm, composed, and convincing. He explained the situation away, framing it as a misunderstanding between adults. Despite obvious warning signs, despite pleas from witnesses, the officers believed Dahmer. They returned the victim to him. That decision would echo through history as one of the most devastating failures of judgment in modern criminal investigation. From that moment forward, something shifted inside Dahmer. The system had validated him. Authority had sided with him. The risk of consequence felt distant, almost imaginary. His confidence grew. His caution faded. He began to believe he was invisible. That belief is dangerous in any criminal, but in someone like Dahmer, it became catastrophic. His behavior became increasingly reckless. He stored evidence inside his apartment instead of disposing of it immediately. He documented his actions. He kept objects that tied him to his crimes. These were not mistakes made out of ignorance. They were symptoms of arrogance and compulsion. Dahmer was no longer just killing. He was building a personal archive of control and memory, convinced he would never be forced to answer for it. Outside those walls, life continued. People went to work, children played, the world moved on. Dahmer blended into it seamlessly. He worked a steady job. He was quiet, unassuming, forgettable. That ordinariness became his camouflage. Evil, in this case, did not announce itself. It whispered. It waited. It relied on society's tendency to look away from discomfort rather than confront it. As investigators would later reconstruct this period, they realized how methodical Dahmer had become. There was a rhythm to his crimes, a pattern that repeated with frightening consistency. He would feel an urge build, act on it, experience a brief sense of relief, and then sink back into emptiness. That emptiness would grow heavier each time, demanding more extreme actions to fill it. It was a downward spiral with no natural stopping point. Psychologically, Dahmer was unraveling, even as he appeared functional. He drank heavily, yet showed up to work. He isolated himself emotionally, yet craved intimacy in a warped form. He expressed shame and awareness of wrongdoing, yet continued anyway. This contradiction confounded experts. Dahmer was not psychotic in the traditional sense. He understood reality. He understood morality, and that understanding did not stop him. That fact alone forces a disturbing question. If awareness is not enough to prevent evil, what is? The apartment became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of institutional blindness. Police reports, neighbor complaints, maintenance records, all existed, scattered through time, unconnected. No one saw the full picture until it was too late. The system didn't fail once. It failed repeatedly, incrementally, through small decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. This is where the story deepens beyond one man, because Dahmer did not operate in a vacuum. He was enabled by indifference, by assumptions, by the belief that horrific things only happen in obvious places. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Sometimes the most horrifying realities exist quietly, behind a door you walk past every day. As the number of victims grew, so did the risk. Dahmer was pushing the limits of what he could control. His routine became more fragile. The margin for error shrank. One mistake, one unexpected interruption, one moment of resistance could bring everything crashing down. The question was no longer if he would be caught, but when. And when that moment came, the truth would be far worse than anyone imagined. And that moment was coming. What authorities would soon uncover inside that apartment would redefine the case entirely. Evidence so overwhelming, so disturbing, that even seasoned investigators would struggle to process it. The scale of the crimes, the nature of the discoveries, and the depth of Dahmer's obsession would shock the nation and force a reckoning not just with one killer, but with the failures that allowed him to operate for so long. At this point in the story, Dahmer is at his peak, fully immersed in his compulsions, protected by his own confidence, unchecked by the system. The spiral has tightened. The margin for error has vanished, and when the fall comes, it will not be quiet. It will expose everything.
The night Jeffrey Dahmer was finally stopped did not begin with a grand investigation or a dramatic police operation. It began the same way his crimes had continued for years, quietly, almost invisibly. A moment that could have passed unnoticed, a moment that almost did. A young man ran, barefoot, disoriented, bleeding. He staggered through the streets of Milwaukee, struggling to stay upright, his wrists bound, his mind clouded by drugs. Two women noticed him. They did not look away. They did not assume someone else would intervene. They stopped. They asked questions. They made a decision that countless others before them had not. They called the police. When officers arrived, the situation seemed confusing but not immediately catastrophic. Dahmer appeared calm, cooperative, almost relieved. He explained that the young man was his boyfriend, intoxicated, having a misunderstanding. The explanation was disturbingly familiar. Police had heard versions of this before, and in earlier years, those explanations had been enough. This time, something was different. The young man was clearly terrified. He could barely speak. His injuries were visible. The women insisted something was wrong. One officer followed Dahmer back to his apartment to sort things out. That walk down the hallway, ordinary, quiet, unremarkable, was the final step into a reality no one was prepared to face. The smell hit first. It was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was the kind of smell that forces the mind to search for explanations it hopes are untrue. Rotting food, a dead animal, a plumbing issue, anything but the truth. Dahmer offered excuses: meat gone bad, fish, chemicals. The officer moved further inside. Then came the photographs. Polaroids scattered across the room, images no human being should ever have to see. Bodies posed, dismemberment documented, death frozen in casual frames. The officer did not hesitate. He called for backup. Within minutes, the apartment became a crime scene, and within hours, the world would learn what had been living unnoticed in plain sight. When investigators conducted a full search, the scale of the crimes unfolded layer by layer, each revelation worse than the last. Human remains in the refrigerator, body parts preserved, acid-filled containers, tools carefully arranged. Everything pointed not to chaos, but to routine. This was not a moment of madness. This was a system. Dahmer was arrested without resistance. As news broke, disbelief spread faster than facts. Neighbors watched in horror as evidence was removed from the building. People who had shared hallways with him struggled to reconcile the quiet man they occasionally greeted with the monster now described on every channel. The question everyone asked was the same: how did this happen here? The deeper investigators went, the more uncomfortable the answers became. This was not a failure of one person. It was a failure of many. Police reports resurfaced, missed opportunities, prior arrests, moments when Dahmer had been in custody and released, moments when victims had escaped and were returned to him. Each revelation added another crack to the narrative of inevitability. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Fear, rage, guilt. Entire communities questioned how such prolonged violence could exist unnoticed. Advocacy groups pointed to systemic neglect, to bias, to indifference toward marginalized victims. Dahmer's crimes forced conversations that many institutions had avoided for decades. Inside the interrogation room, Dahmer did not behave as expected. He did not deny. He did not deflect. He spoke calmly, methodically, with a chilling lack of emotion. Investigators later described him as cooperative, almost eager to explain, as if confession was not a burden but a release. Psychologists who evaluated him struggled to define what they were seeing. He understood his actions, he knew they were wrong, yet he felt little remorse in the traditional sense. His concerns seemed detached, intellectual. He spoke about his urges as if describing weather patterns, inevitable, impersonal, unavoidable.
The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in American history. Courtrooms overflowed. Media coverage was relentless. Families of victims listened as details emerged that no human being should have to endure. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane, a move that opened the door to fierce debate about responsibility, mental illness, and justice. Expert witnesses clashed. Some argued that his compulsions rendered him incapable of control. Others insisted that his planning, concealment, and evasion proved full awareness and accountability. The jury faced an impossible task: to decide whether evil could coexist with sanity. In the end, the verdict was clear. Dahmer was found legally sane and sentenced to multiple life terms. There would be no possibility of release, no redemption arc, no second chance. The system that had failed to stop him now ensured he would never walk free again. But even behind bars, the story did not end. Dahmer became a figure of fascination. Other inmates targeted him. Some sought notoriety. Others sought revenge. Guards reported that he seemed resigned, almost indifferent to his fate. He read, he prayed, he spoke to visitors, and eventually, violence found him once more. His death inside prison walls closed the physical chapter of the case, but not the psychological one. Because the real horror was never confined to that apartment. It lived in the ignored warnings, the dismissed complaints, the assumptions that danger always looks obvious. Dahmer did not hide in shadows. He lived under fluorescent lights. He spoke softly. He complied when questioned. And that made him invisible. This is the point where the story becomes more than a catalog of crimes. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of what happens when systems prioritize convenience over confrontation, when discomfort is avoided, when victims are weighed against inconvenience, when the cost of action feels higher than the cost of silence. The discovery of Dahmer's crimes forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about him, but about itself, about who is believed, about who is protected, about who is allowed to disappear quietly. And yet, with all this knowledge, one question refuses to fade. Could it have been stopped sooner? That question lingers, unresolved, setting the stage for the final chapter of this story. Because what remains is not just what Dahmer did, but what the world allowed to happen. Even after the prison doors closed behind Jeffrey Dahmer, the unease did not disappear. In many ways, it only grew. Because once the immediate horror faded, what remained was a far more disturbing realization. This was not just a story of a killer, but the story of a system that repeatedly failed to act. As investigators revisited Dahmer's past, a chilling pattern became impossible to ignore. He had been reported, he had been arrested, he had been questioned. Again and again, he stood in front of authority figures who had the chance to stop him, and again, he was allowed to walk away. These were not isolated mistakes. They were layers of neglect stacked over years, creating the perfect environment for a predator to operate without resistance. This is where theories begin to emerge. Not wild fantasies, but uncomfortable suspicions rooted in documented facts. Why were certain victims not taken seriously? Why were warnings dismissed so easily? Why was Dahmer, time after time, perceived as harmless? Many point to bias. Dahmer's victims were often young men from marginalized communities, people whose disappearances did not generate immediate urgency. Complaints were minimized. Red flags were reframed as misunderstandings. When officers were faced with uncomfortable situations, they chose the path of least resistance, and that choice had consequences measured in lives. Some theorists go further, questioning whether institutions subconsciously protect what feels familiar. Dahmer was white, polite, soft-spoken, non-confrontational. He did not fit the stereotype of danger, and because he did not look like a monster, he was not treated like one. This is not conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It is a mirror held up to societal blind spots. The case forced Milwaukee and the nation to confront how easily evil can hide behind normalcy. It challenged the belief that danger announces itself loudly. Dahmer proved that horror can whisper, comply, and wait patiently. Years later, the story returned to the spotlight in a new form. The Netflix series inspired by Dahmer's crimes reignited global fascination and controversy. For some viewers, it was a grim reminder of a case they thought they understood. For others, it was their first exposure to the depth of the atrocities. But for many families of victims, it reopened wounds that never truly healed. The series sparked heated debates. Was it necessary? Was it exploitative? Did it humanize the killer too much? Or did it finally force the world to confront systemic failures that had been ignored for decades? These questions had no easy answers, but what became clear was that Dahmer's story was no longer confined to court records and police files. It had entered popular culture, and with that came responsibility. Because stories like this carry weight. When retold without care, they risk turning real suffering into entertainment. But when told with intention, they can serve as warnings, not about one man, but about patterns that repeat when vigilance fades. Dahmer did not operate in a vacuum. He operated in silence, in assumptions, in moments where people looked away because intervening felt uncomfortable. That is the most terrifying legacy of this case. Not the brutality, but the permission granted by inaction. Even today, similar stories emerge. Different names, different cities, the same questions. How long did it go unnoticed? Who saw something but said nothing? What warning signs were dismissed as inconvenient? Jeffrey Dahmer is dead, but the conditions that allowed him to exist are not. That is why this story still matters. Not because of the shock value, not because of the headlines, but because it forces a reflection most people would rather avoid. The realization that monsters do not always look monstrous, that danger does not always feel dramatic, and that sometimes the difference between prevention and tragedy is a single decision to take something seriously. This is where the story truly ends. Not with his death, not with the prison sentence, not with a television series, but with a question left in the hands of the viewer. If you had been there, if you had heard something strange, if you had sensed something was wrong, would you have acted? Or would you have trusted that someone else would? That question lingers long after the screen goes dark. And perhaps that discomfort is the most important part of remembering this case. If you believe stories like this should be told with depth, responsibility, and honesty, not to glorify evil, but to understand it, then subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next episodes of Open Case Files. New cases, new investigations, and stories that refuse to stay buried. Because some truths are too dangerous to forget.